Said the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, Friend, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me. Kind of a quaint poem that's been around for a long time, but it expresses the concern that Jesus had for those who follow him. We had taken a break from dealing with the Sermon on the Mount to work our way through those 7 deadly sins. We're going to return to the Sermon on the Mount. And around the world, this message from Jesus is considered one of the most powerful and beautiful ethical systems in the world. It has graced plaques. It has been the source of countless books and teachings. The one question that stands before us is it realistic? Can anybody actually do all this stuff? I want to take a moment to remember to whom Jesus is talking here. The very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. You remember I mentioned that there were actually a couple of levels. Jesus on the hillside would be the one up here teaching. And then close around him were those people who had made a commitment to follow him. And they were there not to just get a moment of inspiration. They were there to follow this teacher to whom they had committed their lives. And then out there further, the people who were really curious. They wanted to know more. They were there to hear a really good message. Now, they're going to hear what Jesus has to say, but this group, those who've committed themselves to Jesus, are the ones who want to hear what he has to say because they intend to do it. Keep that in mind. Jesus is not addressing what he has to say here to everybody generally. He's talking here to people who have made a commitment to follow him. He begins by telling them, a lot of the things you've grown up believing just aren't true. That's always hard to hear from someone you trust. He begins by telling them that a good life, a life that's pleasing to God, is not a life that begins by knowing and following all the rules. I think we better do something about Joe's hair. You know, ponytails in a sanctuary on a Sunday morning. No, you mean to tell me you're not willing to become one of us enough to cut your hair? I pick on Joe because I know he can take it. Now you just shot my illustration to pieces. Joe's growing a ponytail, and then he'll have it cut as a gift. Is it Locks for Love? One of those organizations. An organization that you donate the hair that you've grown, and they provide wigs for people who've lost their hair for any number of reasons. But one of the understandings that we had, even though you won't find this in Scripture, is that God intended men to have short hair. And every picture we've ever seen of Jesus has him with long hair. I'm wondering, do we really know how long Jesus' hair was? The point is, it doesn't matter. Jesus is saying to these people, you've grown up with a number of rules. Now, keep in mind, the rules, meaning the law, God's gift to them, was a good thing. But so many rules had been added to the law that suddenly it was impossible to keep it all. And Jesus is saying, take the rules and throw them away. Let's look at what God intends through the law. A life that pleases God does not follow all the rules. A life that pleases God is first submitted to Jesus. Jesus, this day forward, I do it your way. That moment of submission, putting him in charge, now brings a new perspective. You don't look at the world quite the way you did before. And Jesus gives them an example of how this new perspective will affect your life. Here's the example. For centuries, people have tried to provide themselves some security against the future. Does that sound like anything you or your family have ever done? Tried to provide some security for yourself against the future. He's not attacking the common sense kinds of things. You have a refrigerator because you intend to provide for the future. You have a retirement account because you will need to live beyond retirement and you need to responsibly provide some measure of security for your future. What Jesus is concerned here is those people who obsessively try to guarantee their future. God might not come through for me, so I better make sure that I put a huge nest egg away, just in case. Jesus is trying to help those who are following him understand that perspective on life, I got to provide for my future no matter what. That perspective on life doesn't work. Because no matter how much you try to save up, the reality is everything that you save has the potential to be lost. In Jesus' time, a garment was considered something that could be handed down. So you stored away carefully. Have you stored things in a cedar chest, trying to prevent moths and larvae from getting to it? Do you know the disappointment of going and finding that no matter what you tried, this thing has fallen to tatters anyway? And when he talks about rust, he's not only talking about the degrading of metal in the form of rust, he's talking about any kind of consuming item like mildew or mold or rats or mice or insects, anything that will eat away what you're trying to save. In our day, we could talk about inflation. Anything that eats away at what you have been trying to use to secure your future. And Jesus said, trying to guarantee your future is a waste of time because everything can fall prey to what will rob you of that kind of future. Okay, Jesus, if I don't stand a chance to secure my future that way, do you have something else in mind? A better way to do this? Funny you should ask. Let me tell you about it, he says. The eye is the lamp of the body. Now he's talking about the perspective. The way you see the world affects the way you respond to it. The way you see the world affects the way you respond to it. A world-class astronomer named Percival Lowell was absolutely convinced that the planet Mars had canals. Every time he looked into his microscope, he would see these clearly visible canals on the surface of the planet Mars. He even mapped them. He developed a thinking that there must be life on Mars for there to have been these canals. What became obvious a number of years later was that what he saw in that eyepiece was not canals on Mars. It was the reflection of his own arteries in his eye. He had developed an illness that enlarged the arteries, and what he was seeing wasn't canals, it was his own arteries. The way you see the world affects how you respond to it. If your eye, if the way you see the world is bad, Jesus says, and he's talking here about things that we've just been discussing. When he talks about bad eyes, he's talking about things like lust or anger or greed. Constant exposure to porn will affect the way a man not only looks at a woman, but the way he treats her, the way he actually sees her, because he begins to believe that what he saw in the porn is how reality is. He winds up with bad eyes, and that bad, lustful eye affects the way he responds to the world. Or anger. If the only way you feel you can actually get what you need is to get angry about it, it will affect the way you respond to the world. And you wind up becoming an angry person. Or greed. Eyes distorted by greed will insist that I have to do what I have to do to get a little bit more or I won't have enough. And you sincerely believe that the only way to get enough to make you feel secure is to get more. It affects the way you respond to the world because your eye is bad. It's distorted. Bad eyes can also mean unfocused eyes. Trying to focus on two things at once. The human eye is an absolutely amazing thing. You can look at me, and then you can look at that picture, and the eye instantly makes the adjustment. But you can't look at both at the same time. Trying to focus on two things at once doesn't work. And what Jesus meant by that disfocus is something that an evangelist I used to know many, many years ago used to say this on a regular basis. There are those people who have just enough of Jesus that they can't enjoy the world, and just enough of the world that they can't enjoy Jesus. They've got that dual focus. Good eyes, on the other hand, are not distorted by anger and lust and greed or a host of other sinful effects. It doesn't mean these eyes are sinless. It does mean that they are not so influenced by anger or lust or greed or the other things that they can't see the best way to respond. The way you see the world affects the way you respond to it. One example. Are you familiar with this acronym that has become very, very popular in recent years? YOLO. Have you seen it? Do you know what it stands for? You want to show them, Frank? You only live once. This phrase, to a degree, is designed to motivate people to live their lives to the full. Unfortunately, it's also been used to justify all kinds of self-indulgence. You only live once. Milk it for everything it's worth. Do everything you can because you're going to be dead a long time. You only live once. YOLO, if it's true, makes sense to indulge every whim. I'm only going around once. I better enjoy everything I can. This way of seeing the world has also been described this way: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. One question I would like to ask: what if YOLO is not true? What if this life is not all there is? What if this life is actually preparation for another life? I won't ask how many of you are retired. Many of you are in that state at this point. Many of you are approaching, I should say many of us are approaching it. So I was thinking, I'm never going to retire. I can't afford to. A few people here are saying that's a long way off. But it really does make sense in our culture to prepare for retirement, doesn't it? Common sense says you're going to be living beyond the working years, and you need to be able to pay the bills, pay for groceries, enjoy a bit, so you set aside a little bit, prepare for retirement. Does it make sense to write a will so that you know that what you want done with your stuff is what's done with your stuff after you're gone? Funeral pre-planning? Don't get morbid, Pastor. The fact is, it makes sense to pre-plan your funeral. So if YOLO is not true, if there really is a life after this one, it would make sense to prepare for that life, wouldn't it? Now, I'm not talking about just getting to heaven. Our faith in Jesus takes care of that step. I'm talking about living when we get there. Does it make sense to prepare for that? If there really is a life beyond this one, it makes sense to prepare for it. If YOLO is true, if you only live once, then you better get that bucket list going. Because when the end comes, you won't have a chance to enjoy all the things. What if life's struggles are not just misery? What if life's struggles are God's way of correcting our vision so that we can actually see life as it is? So that we can get good eyes with a single focus on things that will last, things that matter. What if the things we go through are God's way of letting us let go of the temporary things of this world and invest in things that will not fall apart and let us down? Do any of you have a bucket list? Don't have to raise your hands. But to tell you the truth, a bucket list doesn't have to be YOLO. You want to go on that balloon ride? Then go on the balloon ride. But not because I got to experience everything I can because when I'm dead, it's over. Go on the balloon ride because God has made a world that is magnificent and wondrous. And He's given you a body that can experience wondrous, amazing things. And you go on that balloon ride to experience the wonder of the God who made them and look forward to the day that all the bad stuff is gone and you can see Him face to face. You enjoy the balloon ride, not because I'm going to end, but because there's so much more even better that's waiting for me. So, how do we prepare for heaven? What does it mean to store up treasure in heaven? It doesn't mean neglecting the necessities of earth. Storing up treasure in heaven. We tend to think of that as giving to a church, giving to ministries, giving to missions, and so on. And all those things are true, but it also means at least this: investing in relationships now. One day, when the wonders of this world are gone, one day, when even the wondrous nation that we are a part of is gone, and there are no more Americans, only children of God, in that day, the one thing that will go with us into heaven, the one thing that will be eternal, is the relationships we have with people. Look at the person beside you for just a moment. We've done this before. Don't be embarrassed. Everybody else is going to be doing this. Look at the people sitting beside you, or around you, or behind you. Look at somebody else sitting here. Lots of different color hair, lots of different shades of hair, wrinkles, things sagging that didn't used to sag. Do you realize, please remember this, do you realize that the person you just looked at is a being who one day, if you could see them now the way they will be one day, you'd be tempted to fall on your knees in awe at what God has done. And that being will live forever. When these pews are dust and this building is dust and even this wondrous nation of ours is gone, that person you just looked at will be a splendor example of what God has done. And the relationships that you invest in now, that relationship that may result in someone coming to faith in Jesus, that relationship that encourages, that relationship that even helps you sometimes when you are down and hurting, that relationship will go on to eternity. Storing up treasure in heaven means investing in relationships now. Are you doing that? We all understand that YOLO is not true. You don't live only once. How are you storing up for heaven? Pray with me.